Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this breakout session on religious and interfaith leadership in Africa. I'm grateful to have Reverend Dimingu here with us. I'll introduce him in a second. I've got somebody looking for Mr. Abubakr Muhammad, who says he knows him. I tried to look for him yesterday, could not find him, so I hope that he's able to be identified and welcomed and brought here. I said we would gladly accept him a little bit late. But in the interest of time and to avoid any further delay, let me just introduce myself very briefly. This is not about me. My name is David Stanford. I am the Area Legal Counsel for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the Central Africa area, based in Nairobi, Kenya. The Africa Central area covers 17 countries, of which the church is presently registered and active in 12. And we have all of the opportunities and challenges that you might kind of imagine for Africa. Sorry? Oh, my voice carries. They can hear me in the other room. So, sorry. And it's a wonderful opportunity to be there and be working with so many wonderful colleagues. And so I would like to just take this opportunity now. I'm going to introduce Reverend Dimingu, and we'll start with his presentation. And then when Mr. Muhammad arrives, then we will be able to hopefully introduce him, and then he can share his presentation and his thoughts, and then we will go to some questions and answers and any comments that you might have. So let me just move over to the quick introduction of Reverend Dimingu. Reverend Dimingu is an ordained minister of the Methodist Church in Zimbabwe, and he's the current General Secretary of the Zimbabwe Council of Churches and the Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Interreligious Council. Prior to his current appointment, he held the following positions in the Methodist Church: Education Secretary, District Bishop, and Synod Secretary. He holds a master's degree in theology, leadership, and administration, a master's in business leadership, and a Bachelor of Arts with honors in theology and religious studies. His research interests are religion and social transformation, religion leadership, and religion and social justice. So obviously, an eminently qualified person to be talking to us about these topics. So Reverend Dimingu, I'll turn the time over to you. You have between 10 and a maximum of 15 minutes. Okay? Now, would you like to come up front here? How would you like to? Okay. Let's do it.
Thank you, David. Good morning. I've been introduced already, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you for coming to this session and to be part of this conversation on the relationship between religious freedom and peace building in Zimbabwe. My focus will be on Zimbabwe, where I come from, and a bit of Africa, where I also belong. So the presentation will pay special attention to building civil society, democratic institutions, and promoting stability and peace. Zimbabwe, like many other African countries, has a complex history that is characterized by episodes of conflict and instability dating back to the pre-independence period, that is before 1980. On the other hand, Zimbabwe is also a tapestry woven with diverse religious threads, and religious freedom has played a significant role in promoting peace and social cohesion. This presentation will therefore explore the nuanced relationship between religious freedom and peace building in Zimbabwe, focusing on its impact on building civil society, democratic institutions, and the promotion of peace, affirming values. The Zimbabwe 2022 population and housing census report states that the country has an estimated population of 16 million people. According to the 2022 Demographic and Health Survey by the country statistics agency, 85.3% of the population is Christian, 40.3% apostolic, that is the African initiated churches, 17% Pentecostal, 13.8% Protestant, 6.4% Roman Catholic, and 7.8% other Christian. 2% of the population belong to the African traditional religion, 11% reported no religious affiliation, and less than 1% belong to the Muslim community, although the Muslim community still disputes this 1%, but there hasn't been any research that is contrary to the 1% that I indicated. Although there are no statistics of people who practice both Christianity and African traditional religion, that's a syncretism that combine the two, there are reports of an increase in such practices where people are Christians but also practice African traditional religion. There is a small number of Hindus, Buddhists, Baha'i, and Jews in Zimbabwe. On the legal framework, the Constitution of Zimbabwe prohibits religious discrimination and guarantees freedom of religion, allowing individuals to practice and express their faith freely in public or in private. Although the law restricts freedom of assembly, expression, and association, it specifies that it is not meant for public gatherings, held specifically for bona fide religious, educational, recreational, sporting, and charitable purposes. Therefore, religious gatherings are not restricted by any law. The law in our country says that any gathering of people who are more than 15 should seek police clearance unless they are of a religious nature. Therefore, religious gatherings are not restricted in any manner. The government does not require religious groups to register. However, religious groups operating schools, medical facilities must register those institutions with the relevant ministry. These institutions may receive tax exemptions and duty-free privileges with permission from the Revenue Authority. Although the Constitution of Zimbabwe prohibits religious discrimination, the relationship between the government and religious institutions has been complex. Religious institutions, particularly Christian churches, have played a role in promoting peace and reconciliation before and after the country's independence in 1980, a position that has often made them accused of interfering in politics by both the pre- and post-independent governments of our country. While the government seeks to control religious activities in an effort to contain religious organizations from speaking against the excesses of government and politicians, religious leaders have sometimes taken bold stances against government policies, especially during periods of political unrest. The religious leaders in Zimbabwe play a pivotal role in peace-building efforts. They are involved in promoting tolerance, national unity, and reconciliation during political tensions. Religious leaders have been key mediators of conflicts in Zimbabwe, advocating for dialogue and peaceful resolutions to conflicts. Ecumenical organizations such as the Zimbabwe Heads of Christian Denominations, the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, and the Catholic Bishops' Conference often publish pastoral letters calling for peace and tolerance whenever human rights and freedoms of the people are being violated, these bodies individually and collectively have been calling for a national dialogue in an effort to find lasting peace in the country. These slides here shows two pictures of the church's involvement in calling for dialogue in our country. The first one shows the religious leaders with the leader of the opposition party. That was after the elections that was held in August 2023. And the other one shows the same church leaders meeting with the leadership of the ruling party, trying to call for dialogue after the elections. What is interesting about one of the pictures where there are many people which is headed CC party, part of that delegation is not only from the religious leaders in Zimbabwe, but religious leaders from Africa who had come to be in solidarity with the people of Zimbabwe during their elections under the banner of the All Africa Conference of Churches. So we have people who had come from South Sudan, some have come from Ghana, Mozambique, Malawi, Botswana, Tanzania. Quite a number of African countries, religious leaders came to Zimbabwe to be in solidarity with the Zimbabwean people and also offer prayers and speak to the national leaders promoting peace. The second one is on religious leaders promoting peace. The first one there is the picture where there is someone with a colored scarf. That is the state president of Zimbabwe, and those are the religious leaders who visited him before the elections to push for a peaceful electoral process. And the conversation was around him affirming that he will promote peace and ensure that the electoral process will be peaceful. And the second picture there is the same religious leaders on the same day, after visiting the state president, visited the leader of the main opposition party in Zimbabwe to also impress upon him that he should respect the electoral process and even the results of the elections. And what is interesting about that is that both of them respected and appreciated the role the church and the religious leaders were playing in the electoral processes and promoting peace in the country. And in as far as building democratic institutions, religious institutions in Zimbabwe have contributed to building civil societies by promoting values such as tolerance, empathy, and social justice. These efforts have been crucial in fostering a culture of peace and stability. And this mainly happened towards their elections, which are normally violent in our country, and religious leaders have played a very critical role in ensuring that the processes are not violent and there's promotion of peace. And by advocating for human rights and democratic values, religious leaders have played a major role in strengthening democratic institutions in Zimbabwe. The religious institutions under the banner of the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, during elections, they ran a campaign called I Pray, I Vote campaign, where they were trying to ensure that they infuse the element of faith in the democratic processes and encouraging people not to be violent and also uphold their spiritual values and also pray, and as well encouraging people to participate in electoral processes. So the I Pray, I Vote campaign made a lot of difference and also promoted peace during the electoral processes. Their involvement in the political discourse is often pushed for greater accountability and transparency in government processes. On this slide, these religious leaders participating in election observation. The religious leaders, these as well, they are not only from Zimbabwe, but they are also from Africa. They came through during our elections and participated in observing elections Some of them were from Eswatini, some from South Africa, and some from other countries around the nation of Zimbabwe. So the religious leaders had really contributed a lot in promoting peace in Zimbabwe. The challenges, government interference. Religious institutions often face challenges from the government, including monitoring and interference of their activities. Because of the political instability, government always look at the religious institutions with a suspecting eye, because the religious institutions have been very vocal since prior to independence on the excesses that governments often do and the human rights abuses. Religious extremism also is a challenge. In Zimbabwe, there have been instances of religious extremism which poses challenges to peace and stability. Politicization of religion is another challenge. Politicians, in some cases, use religious organizations and leaders to further their political agenda, turning religious gatherings into political rallies, which is an element that is a threat to peace, because those who does not subscribe to the ideologies of those parties and they are members of those religious bodies tend to not to accept and not to take that lightly. So politicization of religion has been a major problem in the recent past in Zimbabwe. In conclusion, the interplay between religious freedom and peace building in Zimbabwe highlights the important role that religious leaders and institutions play in shaping the country's social and economic landscape. Despite facing the challenges of government interference and attempts to control religious activities, religious institutions and religious leaders have continued to be vital in promoting peace, stability, and democratic values in Zimbabwe. I thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dimingu. I think all attempts to find Mr. Muhammad haven't been successful, and so I think we'll start by opening up the floor to any questions that you might have. I have some that I can also use to start the discussion if there aren't any. We have some microphones here, and I'm sure that Reverend Dimingu would be able to very ably answer any questions that you might have based on his presentation or based on the concept of religious interfaith cooperation as a whole.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a wonderful presentation. I'm Professor Abiola Soni, Dean, Faculty of Law, University of Lagos. I think beyond what the Constitution may provide, we need to look at what is happening in the communities where people live, where people work, where people play, and then focus more on some subtle minimization of the rights guaranteed under the Constitution. So we need to look at what the advocacy groups are doing relating to the enforcement of rights. And the second issue I would like to highlight is the role of religious leaders in political space. In Nigeria, there's a recent experience where in an election held about 10 days ago, a major political party pulled out of the peace effort on the basis that it's becoming normalized and there is no follow-up and there are no consequences for. This is not to say that the peace effort is not achieving any results, but we do not have any data on it. So maybe we need to follow up on some of these interventions and also ensure that people are made to account for any political violence that can be traced to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, in effect, Reverend Dimingu, a two-part question. Do you have any thoughts around local enforcement of constitutionally guaranteed rights of freedom of religion, first of all, and then secondly, any experience with and comments on instability that can be fomented sometimes by religious leaders that can potentially lead to violence? Is that a summary, effective summary? Thank you. Your thoughts, if you have any, Reverend Dimingu?
Thank you.
Does he need a microphone, or is it?
It's on.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Prof, for what you have raised. Indeed, that's Africa. What you have raised, they are very critical, but because the instability that can be caused by even religious leaders is also critical, and in as far as political interference is concerned, because some of the religious leaders also, they've become political. That's what has become a challenge in Africa. They support some political parties, and then it violates the religious freedom of some of the people who are adherents to their religious organizations. And that is a problem in Africa, that many people are trying to find how we can deal with that. But otherwise, the issues that we have raised of what the Constitution says and what happens in the communities is that many times in Africa and in Zimbabwe in particular, the political leaders does not really adhere to the Constitution. The Constitution will be saying something else, but in terms of implementation, in terms of how things are done on the ground, it will be different. So on paper, the Constitution says something else, but on the ground, what happens is different from what is in the Constitution. So that is really a big challenge. But the religious leaders have been continuously calling for the political leaders to adhere to the Constitution. But obviously, the narrative will be that the religious leaders are now involved in a regime change agenda. So those things, like I said, that the relationship between the government and the religious leaders has been very complex, since even before the attainment of independence, because when the religious leaders were calling for human rights and human dignity before independence, they were being praised by the same governments now who are in power. And now when the religious leaders try to call for respect of human dignity, human rights to the new government after independence, they accuse them again of trying to push for a regime change agenda. So these are the challenges that are also prevalent in Zimbabwe.
Thank you. I'll just add a comment to that might give rise to a follow-up question. I have noticed in the past year and a half approximately that I've been serving in my current position that there has been quite a wave across several of the countries in the area that we support of clamping down, if I can put it that way, or significant attempt to apply additional regulation and controls on nonprofit religious societies by many governments. And I was curious as to why that seemed to be kind of a bit of a trend, almost, that one government seemed to then do it on top of another, and it was curious to me. And then I realized, I think that exactly as Reverend Dimingu has said, is that many governments are maybe afraid is too strong a word, but they are concerned about the possibility of religious organizations becoming a groundswell or providing a groundswell of anti-government support under the guise of religion, and that there is more politics in the daily or weekly services and discussions, in the churches and in the mosques, etc., than there is actually discussion of religious principles. So I'm wondering if that's something that you have seen on the ground or have experienced, first question. And then secondly, are there some religious leaders, reverends and priests, et cetera, who are not engaging in that dialogue, who can help lead and show leadership to kind of avoid the over-politicization of religion and help minimize the concerns of governments who feel like they are being attacked from within religious organizations?
Thank you. Indeed, there has been an increase on many governments in Africa trying to curtail the powers of religious organizations. In Zimbabwe, in particular, the parliament has just passed a bill which is now going to be signed by the president, which is commonly known as the Private Voluntary Organization Bill, which also seeks to tell the powers of the civic organizations and trying for the government to closely monitor the activities because there's a belief that they've been very vocal and in the absence of formidable opposition parties, those organizations have become accountable. They would be holding the government accountable more than the opposition political parties. So indeed, that has been on the rise, and in Zimbabwe, as you highlighted, in Zimbabwe now, if the president signs the bill into law, maybe this week or next week, obviously there is going to be, it will have a huge impact on the civic organizations. We are not sure what will happen to religious organizations, but most of them obviously will be affected, although we try to get an assurance from the government that the churches will not be affected. But in terms of when the law is being applied and interpreted, it can be different. So it's something that we are yet to see what will happen. But indeed, there's been that trend of trying to to curtail the powers of the civic organizations. The second one, the religious leaders in Zimbabwe now have come up with a group of eminent people, retired religious leaders, who can act as the face of the national dialogue that the religious leaders are pushing, so that they can be able to speak to the government, to the political parties, and so also to the church in trying to bring social cohesion and peace within the country. So, yeah, the efforts are there, and the group of eminent persons has been set up, but we are yet to see how it will materialize in terms of bringing tangible results of the process.
Okay, so early days of that process, is safe? It hasn't yet, you don't yet have tangible results. It's still early days of that process. Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you. My name is Tim Stratford, and I'm involved with the G20 Interfaith Forum. Starting in December, South Africa will be the president of the G20, and so meetings during the coming year will, I think, have a special focus on Africa. One question I'm thinking about is very much related to what you've just been discussing, but indeed it is a challenge for religious interfaith organizations to interact with government and to show how valuable the government's interaction with us can be for the government, and do it in a way where we can still speak candidly, where we feel like we need to be critical of the government. This is very tricky and challenging. And so my question is, have any of these groups given some thought about best practices? That is, if we are religious organizations, what are some of the principles or the best practices that we could follow that would help us to be more successful when we're interacting with governments?
Thank you. Your thoughts, Reverend Dimingu?
Okay, thank you. Yes, those conversations are there on best practices and on how the religious organizations can remain credible voices for the people whenever there are excesses by the government. But however, after the realization by our government of the role of the church and the ground and the moral ground that the church has to speak out and to represent people. There's been also another dimension where I spoke of politicization of religion, where there are other, I would want to call them pseudo-religious organizations, but also counter-religious organizations that are being formed by the government, that will speak the language of the government, that will speak against any voices that may come from the true religious organizations. So that has been another challenge of trying to come up with what could be the best practices that we can have, because whenever the religious leaders speak, there's another religious grouping that will say, we don't support what those religious leaders are saying, because obviously there's been a creation of other religious bodies by the government, and that has been a challenge. And in our last year, when the country had elections, were held some elections, our president's initials are ED, is Emerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa. There was a group of religious leaders who were now calling themselves religious leaders for ED. So that really created a lot of problems. But what we are happy about as a church is that whenever there are, as a church and as a religious organization, is that whenever there are government programs, recently we had, our country hosted the Siddeeq Summit, where the government leaders from our region came together. The government will extend invitations to credible religious leaders, organizations, to be part of that process. And we don't see those created and those that are more political, as if the government knows that these are just political vehicles. But when they really want to see religious leaders and to hear the voice of religious leaders, they come to those credible religious organizations to be part of those processes and for them to appreciate that the church is playing a role in the governance and also in trying to build peace and cohesion within the country.
Right. Thank you. Question?
Yes, just forgive my ignorance about your country and your history, but when you talk about avoiding conflict and building peace, has this been something recently that there has been civil disturbance, civil war, problems between factions of religions in your country recently?
Thank you. Our country attained independence in 1980, and in 1983, soon after independence, there's been some disturbances in one of the regions in our country, where records are saying more than 20,000 people were killed. It was almost like a civil war, because it was internal, and those issues, those past years, has not been resolved. It happened between 1983 to 1987, and that issue has not been resolved. And that region is comprised of people who speak one of the minority languages in the country. So it was like, it's still something that is referred to as being a war that was more ethnic and tribal, the disturbances. And along the way, for the past 6 or so elections that have been held in our country, they've produced a disputed electoral process, and some of them they've been very violent. And this has therefore led to a situation where our country is now highly polarized. And our economic situation and our political situation has not been that good because of that polarization, and also the instability that is there. So when we speak of conflict in our country, it is more on the political conflict between opposition parties and the ruling party. At times that can be very violent. So it's not like that there's been a war recently, but these are the disturbances that happen mainly because of politics. Elections are held religiously after every 5 years, but more often than not, the elections are violent, except the one that we had last year, which was peaceful by all standards, because there were no there wasn't any bloodshed. And this is where, as religious leaders, we were having these campaigns and meeting with the president and the opposition parties and trying to promote peace in the country.
Yeah, let me just, before we go to your question, let me just make a comment on that. I was fascinated by that slogan, I pray, I vote, right? And obviously that was designed to help create a peaceful, nonviolent electoral, or contribute to a peaceful and nonviolent electoral process. Do you think it was the main contributor, or were there other contributors as well? Or how did you see, because that seems to be a differentiator from prior elections, right? Was that the difference maker by involving that concerted effort to work through religious organizations and try to have people identify their religious beliefs with a need for peaceful voting processes?
Yes, to some extent, I would say yes, because part of that, the I Pray, I Vote campaign also cascaded to engaging political players and pushing them towards signing peace pledges. So political players all contesting political parties under the ban of the I Pray, I Vote would come together and sign peace pledges, pledging that we are going to adhere to peace, and part of the process where we are meeting with the political leaders and the state president. So I can say indeed, because even a day before the elections last year, the religious organizations tried to bring together the president and the leader of the opposition under one roof, because they've never met since 2018. So we thought if we bring them together under one roof a day before the election, it will also make a huge impact in terms of accepting the outcome of the election. And the regional leaders, we had the former president of Mozambique, Joaquim Chissano, attending that prayer meeting a day before, although we did not get the state president coming, because he said, I'm already in an election mood now. I'm preparing for elections, but he sent his representatives, and on that on its own, it was a signal from the religious leaders that we were serious about promoting peace and accepting the outcome of the electoral process. Although, unfortunately, the election again produced a contested electoral process. So we are still where we used to be. The issues of legitimacy, where the opposition leaders will not accept that the sitting president was elected in a free and fair manner, and it continues to fuel the challenges that ultimately affect the ordinary people. And that is the concern of the religious leaders, that the ordinary people are the ones who are suffering, because once the political players, the political leaders are not agreeing, the economy suffers, and the ordinary people will continue to suffer economically and otherwise. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, your question.
Yeah, my name is Jim Cook. I had the privilege of introducing the General Secretary to Mexican food the other night at dinner. He seemed to like it. My question is, the youth. The youth, around the world, it seems like the youth are sort of abandoning religion. What is that occurring there in your area? And if so, what effect will that have upon the future relationship between the churches and the government?
Thank you. In Zimbabwe, the issue of youth abandoning religion is not really a challenge. They still part of the religious organizations, and they still hold on to their faith, although we cannot say it's 100%. There are other youth, but the percentage is not very big of those who are no longer adhering to any Christian beliefs. But they believe they might not be attending religious gatherings more often, but in Zimbabwe, I don't think, as of now, it's not really a challenge in terms of the young people are still holding on to their faith. They are still part of it. In the various faiths, and religious bodies that I have indicated.
I just add on to that from a Kenya perspective. If you've been following any of the international news, there have been some significant what we call, or what they are called in Kenya, Gen Z protests, and they've been violent. And there have been they're anti-government protests. They're not anti-religion protests. And personally, I haven't observed, not that I am the standard bearer or the person that would be the best placed to observe, but I have not observed any anti-religious or growing secularism, if you will, within Kenyan society. In fact, I would say, coming from Canada, which is my home, that the secularism that is there and is here in the United States and in many Western countries is far more pronounced than it is in the African communities that I've visited, which is about a half a dozen of them so far. So I see a fairly continual, strong attachment, even across young Africans that I've witnessed, to religion. But I do see a strong and growing disaffection and suspicion of government, and of these many of these young Africans feeling disenfranchised and without proper opportunities in their society. Lloyd.
Reverend Dimingu, thank you again. Excellent review. I just wanted to be sure I was clear. Did you say that religious gathering, religious speech is protected, or is it that's an exception to those rights not being protected? I wasn't clear in whether there's a universal right to gather, a universal right for religious speech, or whether that's just recognized as an exception in the law.
Thank you. That's for asking that fundamental question. What is guaranteed is the gathering and not the speech. You can have the freedom to speak during that gathering, but you don't have the freedom after that speech. Because even those gatherings, I think I need to mention this, that even those gatherings, the people from the security sector will be there. They attend. They will be there to listen. This is where the issue of speeches becomes very key. So you have to know what you say and how you say it, because the gathering of people is not an issue, but what is said there. And it's at times after the gatherings, the security sector can even communicate even with myself and say, can you come and tell us what you were discussing or what was said? We hear this was said there. Can you explain further what you meant? And so the issues of the freedom of speech on paper, yes, but it's not guaranteed.
That creates a level of hostility or resistance, or makes you very careful to speak about your beliefs. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, yes, because the beliefs, I'll give an example of Christianity. The beliefs, when we start to speak about John 10, verse 10, I came that you might have life and have it in abundance. And then speaking to the issue of abundant life and the lack of it in the context. And you just have to know how you will say it. Otherwise, it can create problems as well, as if you are attacking the government. Because what the government have said in those speeches now, when they feel that what has been said during this religious gathering was an attack to the government, even our former President Mugabe, who is known worldwide, would say, come down from the pulpit and join us so that we can deal with you on the same level. So the speech of it is not guaranteed.
Thank you.
That's very interesting. That's a tricky balance. And in many ways, probably a really unmanageable balance, problematic balance. Any other questions from the room here? Okay, well then I have one more. I'm not gonna let you off that easy. You've done a yeoman's work, and thank you so much. Are there any formal formally organized, documented interreligious organizations in Zimbabwe? And if yes, how do they sort of administer and carry forward in their shared goals? Because if they're formal, they will have some shared goals, right? So are you aware of any and how they effectively function?
Yes, we do. We have the Zimbabwe Interreligious Council, which was established about 4 years ago, which comprises of, like I said, the majority of the religious organizations in Zimbabwe are Christian, and but this one also includes the Supreme Council of the Muslim community, and it meets often where there are areas where there's a common interest. If there are issues that they need to deal with, at the moment they don't have a full-time secretariat, but they just meet when there are issues of common interest, when they need to respond to the issues, issues of peace, if there's any violence, like during the time of COVID, and if there are areas where they need the religious organizations needs to come together and speak one language, they do come together. So that is one of the flagship interreligious grouping that we have, where you can see a Christian and a Muslim sitting on the same chair, speaking the same language and responding to issues together. But we are still having some issues with other Christian groupings who are mainly on the Pentecostal side, who could not accept being part of that because they were saying there are other religious groupings that we do not really think that we can work together. But the greater part, the Catholics, the Protestant, ours, the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, and some of the African-initiated churches, they've accepted to be part of that interreligious council. So indeed, there is a council where religious organizations come together. So the issues of also tolerance from other extreme religious organizations who thinks that we cannot associate with this grouping because of the difference in doctrine and how we execute our belief systems.
Thank you. And that would represent the vast majority of the religion's adherents in Zimbabwe, for example, that interreligious council.
Yes, we do, because we in that interreligious council, ZCC, where I belong, which represents mainly the Protestant, is the secretariat, and the Supreme Council of Islamic Affairs in Zimbabwe is the chair, and the Catholic Bishops' Conference is the treasury of the organization, and the African-initiated churches, they are the vice secretary. So all the organizations are there, and they play a role in trying to bring the religious organizations together.
That's wonderful. We have 3 more minutes, surprisingly. One last question.
Okay, good morning. My name is Fortune Sibanda. I am Zimbabwean. So I just want to, don't know whether it is a comment or a person, but it is about membership of that organization, the last one that you have talked about.
The Interreligious Council of Zimbabwe?
Yes. So my question is African indigenous religion represented? Do we also have, say, Rastafarians in that council? Because why I'm saying that is Christianity in general is the most dominant, and you see how these posts are distributed within that interreligious. Remember, we are saying interreligious. But do you see that the posts are being given to, and they are dividing the posts within Christianity. You see that one? Which means also within the context of trying to promote interfaith relations and also recognition of existing religious traditions. There is also this perception that Christianity is the religion. Maybe it's not written in the Constitution, but the way in which that council also is formulated, you can see the membership shows that maybe there is still some homework. I want to give this one as a challenge to the Christian fraternity to also try to promote, because these traditions are there, they are in existence. And you can see that when he says this one has the treasury or has the chairmanship and so on, somehow we are dividing one religion into the various posts, yet it's an interfaith, interreligious platform, right?
Okay.
So that's a comment and a recommendation that maybe they have to work that one. I'm saying that because as a Zimbabwean, I have been researching on some marginalized religions. That's a special interest of research. For example, Rastafari, I have researched widely on that. I don't think they have been approached to say, do you want to be on this council? To be honest. Because in my interaction with such communities like Rastafari movement or Rastafari community, they say they leave us out of such major discussions. So that's why I'm saying it's a challenge to you, Reverend Dimingu, to say, go and reach out so that the perception of religious plurality and religious diversity becomes a reality in Zimbabwe.
Okay.
And in addition, maybe just one last aspect. We tend to say Zimbabwe, yes, is 85% Christian. But do you know that within the 85%, we also have people who are counted under Christianity, but they are actually from African traditional system. So it means in the end, in terms of recognition, have you invited a group of African traditionalists? Because they are there. You know, there is Zinata as something that consists of people who mainly from the medical side. They are a non-organization. But my point is you can also look from their religious perspective and also consider them on that board.
Okay,
Those
thank
are my
you.
Comments and recommendations.
Your comments,
Thank you.
Reverend Dimingu.
Thank you, Professor Sibanda. The issue of those who are Christians and also still practice African traditional religion, I think I mentioned it. You were not yet in my presentation. But African traditional religion is a religion which is practiced by people, but it's not organized, doesn't have a structure. So there's no one whom you can say, come and join us, because it doesn't have a structure. And Zinata that you mentioned, it's for traditional healers. And they'll tell you that ours is not a religion. We are registered as traditional healers. What I'll maybe explore is the Rastafarian. But what we do, say it's an issue where there is an outbreak of a disease, we bring them aboard in our conversation, especially the Zinata and the African traditional healers. Because they don't have an organized body, but in our conversations, even during COVID, we invited them because we knew that some people would even go to them when they are not feeling well. And we wanted to encourage them also to make sure that they encourage people to go to seek medical help and that are beyond what they could do. However, I take what you are saying, but the African traditional religion still has a problem because it doesn't have a structure. And in terms of Christianity, what we also need to agree is that Christianity has got many versions, like the Catholics. They stand on their own. And the Pentecostals, like I said, that the Pentecostals refused to be part of that because they were saying, we can't be in the same room with other religions that we are trying to bring together. So it's still a process, But I really take what you are saying. But our effort is trying to bring the major religions together so that we can promote this interfaith and interreligious culture in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend. Could you please, we're out of time, and but I think we've been richly blessed, even although I think we would have been more richly blessed if Mr. Muhammad had been able to join us, but I don't think we've really missed out on very much, and you've done a wonderful job in helping elucidate important issues and solutions within Zimbabwe and abroad. And you've been very eloquent in your expressions and your answers and your summaries. And so I'd like to thank you very much.